Assassin of Gore. Chapter 1. Coeurus. Coeurus of the caste of assassins crouched on the crest of a small hill, leaning with both hands on the shaft of his spear, looking down into the shallow valley, waiting. He would not yet be welcome. In the distance he could see the white walls, some of the towers of the city of Cordoba, which was being rebuilt. It is an old world in Gorian, Cordoba, meaning a village market, though full few considered the archaic meaning. Coeurus looked on the city. It had once been destroyed by the priest-kings, but now it was being rebuilt. Coeurus was not much interested in such matters. His was the caste of assassins. He had been called to this place. In the early part of the 8th Gorian hour, the distant white walls took the sun and blazed like light in the green hills. The towers of the morning, thought Coeurus, the towers of the morning. The assassin shifted a bit and turned his attention again to the valley, where men below were almost ready. The logs had been prepared and carefully placed. There were hundreds of them, trimmed and squared, mostly of Kalenar wood from the sweet-smelling wine trees of Gore. They crossed one another in intricate traditional patterns, spaces between to permit the rush of air, forming a carefully structured, tiered, truncated pyramid. Coeurus observed, curious, as the last log was placed by two men in the red of warriors. Then 3 women, veiled and in the robes of concealment, each carrying a jar or canister, approached the structure. Even from where Coeurus waited, he could smell the perfumed oils, the unguents and spices, which the women, climbing and moving about the pyramid slowly, as though on stairs, sprinkled about and poured over the wood. Beyond the wood, toward the city, Coeurus could see the procession. He was surprised, for, judging from the colours of the garments of those who marched, it contained men of many castes, perhaps all the castes of the city, only that he did not see among them the white of the caste of initiates. And that puzzled Coeurus, for normally men of the initiates are prominent in such events. These men of Cordoba, he knew, when their city had been destroyed by the priest-kings, had been scattered to the ends of Gore. But, when permitted by priest-kings, they had returned to their city to rebuild it, each bearing a stone to add to its walls. It was said in the time of troubles that the home stone had not been lost, and it had not. And even Coeurus of the caste of assassins knew that a city cannot die when its home stone survives. Coeurus, who would think little of men on the whole, yet could not despise such men as these of Cordoba. The procession did not chant nor sing, for this was not the time for such things, nor did it carry bows of Kalenar, nor were the sounds of the sister or tambour heard in the sunlight that morning. At such times as this, Gorians do not sing or speak. They are silent, for at such times words mean nothing, and would demean or insult. And such times there can be for Gorians only silence, memory, and fire. The procession was led by 4 warriors, who supported on their shoulders a framework of crossed spears lashed together, on which, wrapped in the scarlet leather of a townsman, lay the body. Coeurus watched, unmoved, as the 4 warriors carried their scarlet burden to the height of the huge, sweet-smelling, oil-impregnated pyre. Averting their eyes, the warriors threw back the scarlet leather, that the body might lie free on the spears open to the wind and sun. He was a large man, Coeurus noted, in the leather of a warrior. The hair, he remarked, was unusual. The procession and those who had been earlier at the pyre now stood back from it some 50 yards or so, for the oil-impregnated wood will take the torch quickly and fiercely. There were 3 who stood near the pyre. One wore the brown robes of the administrator of the city, the humblest robes in the city, and was hooded. Another wore the blue of the caste of scribes, a small man, almost tiny, bent now with pain and grief. And the last was a very large man, broad of back and shoulder, bearded and with long blonde hair, a warrior, yet even the warrior seemed in that moment shaken. Chorus saw the torch lit, and then, with a cry of pain, thrown by the warrior onto the small mountain of oiled wood. The wood leapt suddenly alive with a blaze that was almost a burst of fire, and the 3 men staggered backwards, their forearms thrown across their eyes. Chorus bent down and picked up a stalk of grass and chewed on it, watching. The reflection of the fire, even in the sunlight, could be seen on his face. His forehead began to sweat. He blinked his eyes against the heat. The men and women of Corubar stood circled about the pyre, neither moving nor speaking, for better than 2 an. After about half an an, the pyre, still fearful with heat and light, had collapsed with a roar, forming a great fiercely burning mound of oil-soaked wood. At last, when the wood burnt only here and there, and what had been the pyre was mostly ashes and glowing wood, the men of a dozen castes, each carrying a jar of chilled wine, moved about, pouring the wine over the fire, quenching it. Other men sought in the ashes for what might be found of the warrior. Some bones and some whitish ash they gathered in white linen, and placed in an urn of red and yellow glass. Chorus knew that such an urn would be decorated, probably, since the man had been a warrior, with scenes of the hunt and war. The urn was given to him who wore the robes of the administrator of the city, who took it slowly on foot, withdrew towards Corubar, followed by the large blond warrior and the small scribe. The ashes, Chorus judged, since the body had been wrapped in the scarlet leather of a townsman, would be scattered from Tarnbach, perhaps over distant Thasser, the sea. Chorus stood up and stretched. He picked up his short sword in its scabbard, his helmet, and his shield. These he slung over his left shoulder. Then he picked up his spear, and stood there against the sky on the crest of the hill in the black tunic. Those who had come to the pyre had now withdrawn slowly toward the city. Only 1 man remained near the smoking wood. He wore a black robe with a stripe of white down the front and back. Chorus knew that it would be this man, who wore the black, but not the full black, of the assassin, who would deal with him. Chorus smiled bitterly to himself. He laughed at the stripe of white. "Their tunic," said Chorus to himself, "is as black as mine." When the man neared the smoking wood, turned to face him, Chorus descended the hill. He was now welcome. Chorus smiled to himself. The man didn't greet him, nor did Chorus lift his hand to the man, palm inward, saying Tal. The man was a strange man, thought Chorus. His head was totally devoid of hair, even to the lack of eyebrows. Perhaps he was some sort of initiate, thought Chorus. Without speaking, the man took 20 pieces of gold, tarn discs of ore of double weight, and gave them to Chorus, who placed them in the pockets of his belt. The assassins, like most castes, do not carry pouches. Chorus looked curiously down at the remains of the pyre. Only a bit of wood now, here and there, missed by the chilled wine, clung to flame. Some of the logs, however, still smoked, and others held, as though within themselves, the redness of the fire they remembered. but most were simply charred, now dead, stained with the oil, wet from the wine. "Justice must be done," said the man. Chourus said nothing, but only looked at the man. Often, though not always, they spoke of justice. It pleases them to speak of justice, he said to himself, and of fight. It eases them and gives them peace. "There's no such thing as justice," said Chourus to himself. "There is only gold and steel." "Who am I to kill?" asked Chourus. "I don't know," said the man. Chourus looked at him angrily. Yet he had in the pockets of his belt 20 gold tarn discs, and of double weight. There must be more. "All we know is this," said the man, handing him a greenish patch. Chourus studied the patch. "It is a faction patch," he said. "It speaks to me of the tarn races of Ar." "It is true," said the man. The faction patches are worn in Ar by those who favour a given faction in the racing. There are several such factions who control the racing and compete among themselves: the greens, the reds, the golds, the yellows, the silvers. "I shall go to Ar," said Chourus. "If you are successful," said the man, "return, and you will receive 100 such pieces of gold." Chourus looked at him. "If it is not true," he said, "you will die." "It is true," said the man. "Who is it," asked Chourus, "that was slain? Who is it that I am to avenge?" "A warrior," said the man. "His name?" asked Chourus. "Tal Cabot," said the man.